If you thought hygiene on the frontier couldn't improve after part 1 of this video, you might have to think again. The Wild West wasn't just dusty streets and saloons, but a breeding ground for questionable hygiene practices that boggle the mind. Behind the Hollywood image of dashing cowboys and fearless gunslingers lay a world of disgusting hair care practices. Women using rags as sanitary pads, whiskey as a disinfectant, and other grimy habits you can think of. Perhaps the frontier's unhygienic practices were as rough and rugged as the landscape. Let's dive deeper into this gritty world and uncover how the settlers survived unsanitary conditions. Since bathing was challenging, keeping hair clean and groomed was a lost cause. Forget your luxury shampoos and silky conditioners. Settlers couldn't access any of them. What they did have were animal fats, lard, and homemade soaps. Sure, these got the job done in a technically clean sense, but they left hair either greasy enough to fry an egg on or brittle enough to snap like dry twigs. And let's wait to start on combs. These were rare treasures on the frontier, and when people didn't have one, they made do with their fingers or nothing. This, unsurprisingly, made lice infestations a universal experience. Lice were so common that they were almost considered part of the family. If you didn't have lice, your neighbors probably thought something was wrong with you. Here's where it gets wild: the solutions for lice. One popular trick involved rubbing kerosene into your scalp. The same stuff used to light lamps was considered a miracle lice killer. And while it might have suffocated the critters, it also left your head smelling like an oil spill. Another go-to remedy was bacon grease. Why? Who knows? But going around with a head that smelled like breakfast probably won't win you many friends. The solution was often simpler for men: shaving it all off. No hair, no lice. Problem solved. Women, however, had fewer options. Long hair was the standard, not just for style, but because it was easier to disguise the dirt. Intricate buns, or braids, became lifesavers, hiding the grime and allowing women to stretch weeks, sometimes months, between washes. But here's the price of skipping wash day after wash day: scalp infections. Imagine sores, itching, and layers of buildup just sitting there. Hair care in the Wild West wasn't about beauty or hygiene, but survival. So, the next time you're annoyed about your shampoo running out, think of the settlers with their kerosene and bacon grease hair care routine. Suddenly, that bad hair day doesn't seem so bad. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or the outhouse. Downstairs hygiene in the Wild West. You'd think with all the dust, dirt, and, let's face it, the stench, folks would have prioritized keeping things fresh. No, they didn't. For women, hygiene down there was nothing short of a nightmare. Imagine wearing layers of petticoats and heavy skirts in the scorching sun, only to find yourself needing to use the bathroom. Not convenient, right? To save themselves the hassle, women's pantaloons were crotchless. Yes, you heard that right, crotchless. This allowed them to well hover over whatever was a toilet back then. Practical? Sure. Hygienic? Not. And then there was the odor. With no modern products to rely on, women turned to regular douching to keep things somewhat under control. According to Laurel Ives from the BBC, this was seen as a necessary evil to avoid what they called misery, woe, and utter despair. But here's the catch. Those douches often involved harsh chemicals that probably did more harm than good. Now let's talk about periods, because oh boy, it gets worse. Women had to get creative without sanitary pads. Those didn't show up until 1888. Grass, rags, rabbit fur, sheep's wool, you name it. They were stuffing just about anything absorbent down there to get by. And tampons? Forget about it. They wouldn't exist until 1931. You can imagine the discomfort. But wait, men weren't exactly living their best hygienic lives either. There was a lot of paranoia surrounding, let's say, that area. By the late 1800s, quack doctors were pushing all sorts of nonsense remedies for men's troubles. One of the weirdest solutions? Circumcision. Believe it or not, some experts claimed it could cure everything from syphilis to epilepsy and even prevent masturbation. Yes, you heard that correctly. And if that wasn't bizarre enough, some doctors even claimed circumcision could cure hysteria in women. Let that sink in for a second. If nothing else, this little tidbit shows just how wildly misunderstood human anatomy was back then. All right, let's sink our teeth into one of the grimiest corners of Wild West hygiene, dental care, or the lack of it. We brushed on this topic in the first series of this video, but now it's time to chew over the horrifying details. First off, diets on the frontier weren't exactly teeth-friendly. Settlers were chowing down on rock-hard biscuits, sugary treats, and canned goods, with fresh fruits and veggies being rare luxuries. This combination spelled disaster for their pearly whites, or what was left of them. Cavities, gum disease, and rotting teeth were practically unavoidable. So, how did they tackle dental hygiene? Well, most didn't. Toothbrushes and toothpaste were rare, so people improvised. Some chewed on sticks to scrape off buildup, while others used baking soda or charcoal to rub on their teeth. Sounds primitive, right? But for many, even that was too much effort. They just let nature take its course, which usually meant losing teeth by their 30s.
Now, let's talk about what happened when a toothache became unbearable. Forget gentle care and modern dentistry. Tooth extraction was the one-size-fits-all solution, and it was as horrifying as it sounds. Who performed these extractions? Oh, just your local barber or blacksmith, the same guy sharpening horseshoes or giving you a haircut would also be yanking your molars. And anesthesia? Ha! Just forget it. But here's the kicker. Infections from these crude extractions were ridiculously common. Dirty tools, unwashed hands, and the total lack of sterilization turned a simple tooth pull into a potential death sentence. There were professionals offering basic dental care for those with the money. But don't get too excited. These so-called dentists often reuse tools without cleaning them. Imagine sitting in a chair, watching someone grab an unsterilized pair of pliers that had just been in another person's mouth. Blood-borne diseases were almost guaranteed, but at least that toothache was gone. Let's head into the Wild West kitchen, or should we call it the germ factory? If you think today's dishwashers make life easier, wait to hear how cooking utensils were cleaned back then. Or weren't at all. Here's how it went down. Water was a precious commodity, so settlers should have used it for luxuries, such as scrubbing pots and pans properly. Instead, cooking utensils were often rinsed or dunked in the same filthy water used for everything else. And by everything else, I mean washing hands, rinsing clothes, and sometimes even watering livestock. Grease and food residue clung to the surfaces of plates, pans, and utensils like old friends. And over time, these grimy layers became part of every meal. Delicious, right? Settlers got creative when water ran dry, which happened more often than not. They'd grab the nearest rag, give their cooking tools a quick wipe, and call it a day. But let's be real, these rags were disasters in their own right. Rarely cleaned, they were teeming with bacteria and grime, spreading germs like it was their job. A quick swipe with one of these filthy clothes practically guaranteed that your next meal came with an unwanted side of illness. But wait, it gets worse. Food scraps left behind on these improperly cleaned utensils attracted unwelcome dinner guests, including flies and rodents.
It wasn't uncommon for settlers to wake up to the charming sight of mouse droppings scattered around their cooking area. If that doesn't ruin your appetite, I don't know what will. All of this led to one inevitable outcome: foodborne illnesses. With no refrigeration and barely any concept of sanitation, meals often turned into ticking time bombs. Diarrhea, vomiting, and even death were all too common consequences of contaminated food. In the Wild West, cooking wasn't just about filling your belly. It was a high-stakes gamble for survival. So, the next time you scrub a frying pan or load the dishwasher, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. At least your kitchen isn't actively trying to kill you. Frontier outhouses and makeshift latrines were prime examples of how sanitation fell short in the Wild West. Most towns and settlements lacked proper sewage systems, so human waste was disposed of in shallow pits or simple wooden structures built over a hole in the ground. These outhouses were breeding grounds for flies, which spread disease as they moved between waste and food sources. Sometimes, settlers didn't even bother digging pits and simply relieved themselves in the open. This practice contaminated water sources and contributed to outbreaks of diseases like cholera and dysentery. Towns with upstream outhouses unknowingly poisoned their drinking water, leading to devastating consequences. The smell from poorly maintained latrines was overwhelming, and settlers often avoided them altogether. Unfortunately, this only exacerbated the problem as waste accumulated unchecked. It was a vicious cycle, highlighting how ill-equipped the frontier was to handle basic sanitation needs. Frontier barbershops weren't just for haircuts. They were makeshift medical centers where barbers performed minor surgeries, tooth extractions, and bloodletting. However, their tools were rarely sanitized, and diseases like tetanus and blood poisoning were common. Shaving was another risky endeavor. Straight razors, often dulled by repeated use, could cause nicks and cuts that easily become infected. Settlers who shaved at home faced the same issues, especially without access to clean water or antiseptics. Barbershops may have been a social hub, but were also a hotbed of unsanitary practices that put customers at risk. Every visit was a gamble with hygiene, from unwashed towels to shared combs. Are you still convinced the Wild West was all about rugged charm and cowboy sunsets? Well, think again, because even bedtime came with its horrors. Settlers didn't just crawl into cozy, fresh sheets at the end of a long day. Nope. Their beds often crawled with what they jokingly called seam squirrels. Spoiler alert, these weren't cute critters. Seam squirrels were code for bedbugs and lice, and they were everywhere. Beds back then were far from the plush mattresses we know today. Instead, they were stuffed with straw, feathers, or horsehair, perfect nesting spots for these pests. And because cleaning wasn't exactly high on the frontier to-do list, infestations were practically guaranteed. Settlers weren't just sleeping. They served an all-you-can-eat buffet for bed bugs every night. These little bloodsuckers weren't just itchy nuisances. They could spread diseases and wake settlers with swollen, itchy bites. The so-called solutions were almost as bad as the bugs themselves. Sprinkle sulfur powder on your bedding. Sure, if you wanted to choke on the fumes. Rub kerosene into the mattress. Great idea, if you don't mind sleeping in a fire hazard. Travelers had it even worse. Inns and boarding houses often featured communal beds, meaning you weren't just snuggling with lice and fleas from your travels. You were inheriting an entire ecosystem from the previous guest. Imagine lying down after a long journey, only to realize you're sharing your bed with a tiny army of unwelcome roommates. Sleep wasn't a time to recharge in the Wild West. It was a nightly battle with nature's tiniest villains.
If you managed to rest without itching, scratching, or inhaling sulfur fumes, you'd wake up feeling like you'd hit the jackpot. Step into a Wild West saloon and find a rowdy and unsanitary scene. Amid the clinking of glasses and the laughter of cowboys, there was one unexpected feature: the communal towel. These grimy rags hung behind the bar, supposedly for patrons to wipe beer foam off their faces. But let's be real, those towels were anything but clean. Imagine dozens of dusty, sweaty cowboys, miners, and ranch hands grabbing the same towel without care. They'd swipe it across their faces, hands, and even the bar itself, all while passing along whatever germs they'd been carrying. And believe me, in a time when hand washing was more of a suggestion than a routine, those towels were breeding grounds for bacteria. These multi-purpose rags didn't just soak up beer foam, they soaked up sweat, dirt, and who knows what else. Spills on the bar? Wipe it with the towel. Dirty hands after a game of cards? Towel it up. Need to clean up a fight-induced bloody nose? You guessed it, the communal towel was on standby. The health risks were staggering. Pink eye? Check. Skin infections? Probably. Respiratory illnesses? Almost guaranteed. But hygiene wasn't a top concern in the Wild West. Survival was. If you walked out of the saloon with your health intact, you were either lucky or had an immune system built like a steel trap. Despite their obvious hazards, these towels were just another quirk of frontier life. To the average saloon-goer, they were as much a part of the experience as whiskey shots and piano tunes. But in hindsight, they were also a prime example of how the Wild West wasn't just wild. It was downright germy. Suppose there's one image that defines the Wild West. In that case, it's cowboys chewing tobacco and spitting into spittoons, or more often, missing them entirely. Spitting wasn't just a habit. It was a cultural norm. Streets, saloon floors, and even public buildings were covered in a sticky layer of tobacco spit, turning these spaces into unsanitary cesspools. The prevalence of spitting poses a serious health risk. Tuberculosis, also known as consumption, was rampant during this time, and spitting only made it easier for the disease to spread. The problem became so severe that some towns passed laws banning spitting in public places. Despite these efforts, enforcement could have been better at best. Many settlers ignored the rules, and the habit plagued towns well into the early 20th century. It wasn't just an eyesore, but a constant reminder of how little regard the frontier had for public hygiene. If you ever imagined settlers reaching for a roll of toilet paper after a trip to the outhouse, perhaps you need to unlearn. Toilet paper was widely available in the late 19th century, and even then, it was considered a luxury. Frontier folk had to make do with whatever was on hand, including corn cobs, leaves, or even pages torn from catalogs like the Sears Roebuck. These alternatives weren't just uncomfortable, they were unsanitary. Corn cobs, for instance, weren't exactly designed for hygiene, and using them often led to skin irritation and infections. Leaves weren't much better, especially if settlers accidentally grabbed poison ivy or other harmful plants. For those who could afford it, cloth rags were an option. But these had to be washed and reused. This solution wasn't much cleaner, considering the already poor state of could-have-been actresses. The lack of proper sanitation contributed to widespread health issues, including gastrointestinal diseases that were often fatal. The Wild West wasn't just dirty, it was downright dangerous when it came to sexually transmitted infections. With the lack of education about safe practices and the prevalence of brothels in frontier towns, venereal diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea were rampant. Prostitutes, who often had little to no access to medical care, unknowingly spread infections to their clients.
who then passed them on to others. The symptoms of these diseases were debilitating, leading to everything from painful sores to blindness and even death. Syphilis, in particular, was a major problem, as it could cause severe neurological damage in its later stages. Treatment options were as crude as you'd expect. Settlers relied on mercury-based ointments, which were ineffective and toxic. The lack of proper medical knowledge meant that many sufferers lived in pain and isolation, their conditions worsening until they became untreatable. Venereal diseases weren't just a personal issue. They were a public health crisis that highlighted the lack of hygiene and medical care in the Wild West. When you think of whiskey in the Wild West, you probably imagine cowboys throwing back shots at a saloon, not settlers using it as a cleaning solution. But whiskey was more than just a drink out on the frontier. It was a jack-of-all-trades hygiene tool. With no access to proper cleaning supplies, antiseptics, or even basic hygiene products, settlers leaned on whiskey for everything from hair care to emergency medical treatments. Whiskey was a surprising substitute for shampoo for hair care. Settlers believed the alcohol could cut through the layers of grease and grime that built up over weeks of neglect. And while it probably did remove dirt to some extent, it wasn't exactly nourishing. The alcohol dried the scalp, left hair brittle, and did nothing for the lice problem plaguing many settlers. Still, in a world where bathing was rare, whiskey was considered an upgrade.
In medical emergencies, whiskey's role became even more critical. Frontier doctors and surgeons lacking sterilizing agents turned to whiskey to clean their hands, wounds, and surgical tools. It was better than nothing, but far from ideal. Unsterilized tools and improper cleaning techniques still caused rampant infections, turning minor injuries into life-threatening conditions. Whiskey was also poured directly into wounds as a disinfectant, a practice as painful as it sounds. The burn of alcohol on an open wound was unbearable. Still, settlers believed it was the price to pay for avoiding gangrene or other infections, and when the pain became too much, settlers could rely on whiskey for another purpose, dulling their senses. Patients often downed a hefty amount of whiskey before undergoing primitive medical procedures, using it as a crude anesthetic. Ultimately, whiskey's use in hygiene highlighted just how limited the options were in the Wild West. It wasn't a miracle solution, but it was better than nothing in a world without modern medicine or hygiene products. If nothing else, it gave settlers a sliver of hope and maybe a buzz while facing the harsh realities of frontier life. We've all heard the tales of the good old days, but after what we've uncovered so far, we've got to ask, were those days as good as they say? Thanks for watching. If you find this video interesting, please hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on your notification bell. See you in our next video.